Chapter 10 Debut. When the news started playing her video, Sana let herself relax. Over the first day, she'd finished grinding an entire Suncatcher's worth of glass and watched enough modern dance routines to wreck her recommended feed. She'd stayed twitchy all through dinner, and her mom had eventually banished her to her room to get a grip on herself. Fred had followed her with pathetic meows until she picked him up like a fuzzy football and gave him the attention he wanted. That did make her feel better. The next day had dragged on like time had been dipped in molasses. Sana alternated between scrolling through news sites, shadowboxing with the bots, and beating herself up for using a plan that relied so much on other people. Her hands flexed near incessantly, and she couldn't seem to think of anything other than her own reckless stupidity. In a short-lived distraction, she worked on testing the limits of what she could make as disguises. The attack on day one had killed her enthusiasm for experimentation with solid constructs. The bots were something to survive, control, and hide, not something to use, but learning about them seemed important with another nanotech manipulator gunning for her. The more she learned about what she could make, the more arbitrary her limits seemed. Rollerblades and ice skates counted, chains thicker than a standard gold necklace didn't. Blankets worked, tents failed. Her last test was simply holding her hand out, stilling her emotions, and thinking, I want a weapon. She hadn't expected to get one. The javelin was weighed down by bad memories. It was the tool that had almost killed her dad and her cat that first day. Of course, it was the only thing she could make that would have any use in a fight. Why couldn't she have a sword? One of those would make her feel like a demon slayer. This thing just made her feel helpless and sick. She dropped it and let it shatter upon contact with the floor. That was enough testing for a long time. If she figured out how to make real constructs, she was never using a spear again. Day 3 dawned with no news on the video front. Sana paced and considered the merits of dropping a copy of the video on the front desk of the police station and booking it immediately afterwards. Why couldn't she have mailed it? Return addresses. Handwriting. Someone could have seen her pick up the envelope. She was a moron. Yeah, that last one sounded about right. She groaned and buried her face in her arms. Was it too late to hand over the bots? She'd be doing the gene pool a favor. By the hour before the deadline, she'd all but broken another necklace from how hard she'd been tugging on the chain. Fortunately for her, a news site she'd been scrolling through uploaded a report. The picture displayed a shot from her video. She sighed in relief and let it play. They'd put up a full copy, which was good. She wouldn't have wanted to be seen as a threat because of misleading editing. That said, the video itself made her cringe. Swarm sounded stilted and flat, like she was reading a business email. Not a great first impression. She let the video play all the way through, then let her phone drop onto the couch cushions and her head fall back onto the armrest. I'm an idiot and the worst, she declared to no one. At least it was out there. She chose to spare herself further humiliation and paused the video before it could loop, instead scanning through news sites to see the public reaction. It was a mixed bag. A few reporters were speculating about her. Some decried her as a supervillain in the making. Some seemed to take her statement about staying out of super fights as a good thing, and the most optimistic were discussing her potential as a new homegrown. Oddly, they were all referring to Swarm as a man. Sana hadn't hidden her figure that well, had she? All of a sudden, a breaking news report popped up. It was titled, Prince Snow Attacks Sterling Memorial Hospital. Details to follow. What? Why was he attacking Calabria's biggest hospital? Sana clicked the link and watched the live stream with mounting dread. Prince Snow was standing in the parking lot, back to the cameras. The front of the orthopedic wing was already demolished. Sana watched in horror as a construct that looked like a giant batleth slowly coalesced above the hospital and fell on it at an angle, shearing off a huge chunk in the process. Prince Snow finally noticed the camera crew. He faced them, and his eyes were cold. Swarm? Wrong answer. He turned back to the hospital to continue his rampage. Sana couldn't watch. Everything had gone numb. This was her fault. She'd miscalculated, and now innocent people were paying the price. Only her dad's orders kept her from going out and making things right. She paced back and forth, hands flexing with every other step. She felt so useless. She should be out there fixing her mess, not stuck in the house with the bots buzzing against her skin in a mirror of her agitation. She needed to talk to someone. Mom or Dad, but they were at work, and she didn't want to. The train of thought came to a screeching halt, then caught fire. Her mom was working in the ER. Prince Snow was attacking a different wing, but it was a matter of time before he moved on. Obedience to her father briefly warred with love for her mother. Love won. Sorry, Da, she whispered as she gathered what she needed. Sana climbed out the window in full costume, sans shoes. She hit the ground with an impact that made her ankles twinge, used her knowledge from the day before to make a pair of rollerblades from some of the bots, then turned the rest into a satchel stuffed with a comically long scarf. She looked bizarre and insane, but not superhuman. Perfect. She'd half expected to fall on her face at the first movement, but an experimental push proved she was as graceful on wheels as she had been on her own 2 feet. Her body made tiny adjustments each time her feet shifted, and she knew the exact position of the wheels as they spun. It was a bizarre feeling, but she didn't have time to be weirded out by it. A couple of people gave her funny looks, but nobody tried to stop her during the first few blocks. A small group of boys even cheered when she leapt clean over a bench towards them, then wove around them closely enough to ruffle their clothes. A brave one slapped her on the back as she passed. Despite everything, she smiled. As she got closer to the hospital, the number of people on the street thinned, but those that were there started to recognize her, and they were all walking away from the hospital. Where before she felt fine skating by within arm's reach, now she started to give people a wide berth. She kicked more strongly. The heat wave had yet to break, and she felt stuffy and hot with even the smallest exertion. Her heart was pounding in her ears. It didn't matter. She had to get there as soon as possible. The final block was where things went wrong. A man noticed her and decided confrontation would be a better strategy than avoidance. "Hey!" he shouted from across the street. "That's Swarm. He's the guy Prince Snow wants. Stop him!" Crap. Sana was far enough away from the people on her side to avoid being grabbed, and nobody nearby looked eager to fight, but a brawl was the last thing she needed right now. She lowered her center of gravity and tugged her hood further up. She doubted she made an appealing target, so maybe she could lose him and keep a mob from forming if she moved quickly enough. While nobody on her side of the street did anything worse than make a half-hearted grab for her, she still had to move around them, and the guy who'd shouted did not let up. He kept pace with her for half a block and seemed to be eyeing the sparse traffic to find a gap big enough for him to make a break across the road. It didn't take him long to find one, and the little ground she gained while he was crossing eroded inch by inch until she wove between the hastily erected traffic cones and the last of the pedestrians dropped off. After that it was a straight shot, and she and he were evenly matched for speed. It was only after arriving at the hospital that Sana realized how bad her plan was. Honestly, it didn't qualify as a plan, given how little thinking ahead had been involved. Or thinking at all. Her pursuer was not making things easier. She could hear the crashes and was glad that her mask and glasses blocked the worst of the dust. It was worth the suffocating, stale air. Harsh coughs from the man chasing her made her wince, but at least he was falling behind. Her hope that he would pull back once rubble was actively falling from the sky was dashed as soon as she entered the parking lot. The place was a wreck. It was torn up enough that her skates became more of a safety hazard than a speed boost, and she hopped up to let the wheels dissolve and hit the ground running on sturdy sneakers. A chunk of hospital came whistling through the air well above her head. The arc was impressive, and she automatically turned to track it. Her pursuer was right in the way. It was going to crush him. He must have seen it. His eyes bugged out, and he put on a burst of speed, but the dust got to him, and he started to cough. Sana had seconds. She dissolved her satchel and threw her arms forward, sending 2 streams of bots out as extensions while the main cloud remained close to her skin. They reached him, and she turned them into scarves wrapped around his waist and arm. The other ends were in her hands. She planted her feet, screwed her eyes shut, and yanked. The boulder came down with a crash. Sana breathed in heaving gasps, and she peeked out of one eye. Her follower was face down on the asphalt, thankfully in one piece. She had no idea if he was breathing or not. She dissolved her scarves and let a few bots rest on his back while she ran over. His chest was rising, which was a good sign. He was groaning, which was excellent. His feet were inches away from the boulder, but not under it, which was best of all. She tapped him on the shoulder. Sir, if you can walk, you need to leave. It's not safe. Can you hear me?" He rolled over, and she saw bruises and small cuts on his face, but nothing obvious that would stop him from leaving. His eyes were open, and he was staring at her in shock. There was no time to let him process. Sana hooked one of his arms around her shoulders and leveraged him into a standing position, then pushed him back the way he'd come. "Get out of here," she insisted. "I can't protect you and hold him off at the same time." "You go!" She shoved him with more force, and he ran. She watched until he was out of the danger zone, then turned back to the rock that had almost killed him. The near-fatal boulder was more than twice Sana's height and pitted with convenient handholds. It proved a passable vantage point, and she clambered up with ease. The view was terrible. Between the craters and rubble, it looked like an active war zone had dropped itself in the middle of the parking lot. Prince Snow was still there, thank goodness, but he didn't have much of the orthopedic wing left to destroy, and the ER was the next building over. Sana could see people moving around in the windows. She knew why they'd stayed when any able person would have evacuated by now. They were unable. Sana's mom had explained it a couple of times as she'd grown up, how there was a system to take bedridden and unstable patients out of the danger zone, but it took manpower and a solid evacuation route. Nurses and doctors would stay behind to set up gurneys and mobile life support, and they'd only leave to escort a patient. The process was slow, but it was the only one they had. If Swarm didn't get Prince Snow's attention soon, he'd go after them, and everyone in there would die. Another boulder hit the dirt, and she flinched. Time to do the thing. Too bad she didn't know what thing she was doing. She summoned the javelin, then reconsidered. She didn't want to hurt Prince Snow. Not really. Yes, he deserved to face consequences, but should those consequences really include potential death or disability? Just because she could didn't mean she had the right, not to mention how she didn't have the stomach for it. She let her weapon go and dropped back behind the boulder. Though she couldn't puncture him into submission, she still had to stop him. The longer she stalled, the more people were at risk. Getting them out was priority 1. If she could get him to focus on her, everyone trapped might get a chance to escape. Could playing for time work? It depended on how fixated she could make him on her. The best way to do that was to make him mad. She could figure out the next steps on the fly. She climbed back up and peeked at Prince Snow. He'd just dissolved his most recent bat'leth and was conducting some kind of invisible orchestra. She abandoned her perch and crept closer until she found another climbing rock closer to her target. This one was smaller but no less easy to scale. At this reduced distance, she could see the embroidery on Prince Snow's shirt and the light reflecting off the gauntlets on his hands. He was facing away from her and locked in his own world. Sana would have to snap him out of it. Well, when drawing ire, there was no better way than insults and blunt force trauma. She didn't have a lot of bludgeoning implements in her arsenal, but a shoe ought to have sufficient mass. At her wish, a rain boot dropped into her palm. Now or never. Oi, bots for brains! She threw the shoe. He turned around with perfect timing. It whacked him right in the chest and sent him staggering. To make things more chaotic, Swarm made the boot explode on impact and returned the individual bots to her cloud. Even with that, she was careful to keep them away from his face, and she pulled the loose bots towards herself instead of letting them shred his flesh. Behind Prince Snow, Swarm saw people in scrubs escorting others with stretchers, monitors, and wheelchairs out of the ER, all taking advantage of his distraction to make a break for it. He didn't notice the fleeing stragglers. His focus was squarely on Swarm. Good. Did you just throw a shoe at me? He demanded. He sounded so scandalized. Swarm cackled and took advantage of his confusion to throw another one, a heavy hiking boot, also primed to shatter in return. Bam! Direct hit. Boot to the head! Swarm cheered. She threw two more, and one for Jenny in the wind. Both hit. Prince Snow's head snapped back, and he cupped his face. Jesus Christ, I think you broke my nose! Swarm took the opportunity to hurl a sneaker at him. The footwear beamed him in the forehead. He spluttered in rage. Okay, as hilarious as this was, Swarm needed a plan, better projectiles, and actual restraints ASAP. Prince Snow was going to be ticked when he regained his bearings, and in a battle of spikes versus shoes, it didn't take a genius to guess the winner. She dropped behind her cover in time for a barrage of spears to go soaring over her head. When they spun around in midair and homed in on her, she rolled out of the way. They impaled the boulder, shattering it into pebbles that bounced off her hoodie with enough force to bruise. Geez, she muttered. This is bad. Well, well, well. Look what the cat dragged out. Seems like I've caught myself a rat. Prince Snow sashayed over to Swarm, who scrambled to her feet and back to keep a safe distance. Safer distance. She didn't actually know what sort of limit Prince Snow's bots had. The volley of spikes that rushed along the ground towards her feet and a sweep of his arm and series of taps of his fingers against each other confirmed that it was greater than hers. She ran and, when that failed, launched herself upwards off a piece of rubble. That spared her mangled legs, but she couldn't escape earning a nasty gash across her calf on the way up. Then she fell towards the spikes, but a bot blanket stretched taut and impaled on three of the tallest served as a makeshift net and kept her from turning into a sauna shish kebab. She landed on her feet and instinctively dropped into a 3-point squat. This saved her life when the edges of the spike field retreated and the spikes in the center grew several inches. Amazingly, the blanket remained unperforated. With the danger zone shrunken, Swarm ran towards the edge of her net and threw herself over the remaining gap. She landed hard, inches away and seconds ahead of the wall of spikes that erupted behind her and tucked into a somersault to keep from damaging her ankles further, though her calf protested the action. Prince Snow forewent another bot attack and rushed her. Sana wasted precious focus bringing her bots back and only had time to raise her forearms in a block before he hurled a punch at her face. The force of the blow sent her skidding back and shot a bright flash of hot pain up her arm. It hadn't even been a good punch, but Prince Snow had at least 50 pounds on Swarm, and that counted for a lot in a fight. His gauntlets exacerbated the issue. She landed on her feet, hissed, and wiggled her fingers. No paralysis, no tingling, no loss of range. Nothing broken then, but the bruise was going to be deep. Too many more hits like that, or one in the wrong place, and she was done for. A damaged sponge she was not. That thought remained in the forefront of her mind as Prince Snow lunged in to close the gap again. She responded by hovering just outside his reach, teasing him with the possibility of contact only to slip to the side or duck around a piece of rubble. It was like baiting a bull as she led him deeper into the hospital's ruin. Better to destroy a wreck, and while she spread her bots in a thin layer on the ground so she knew where to step, he didn't seem capable of doing that. Each of his stumbles bought her precious time to breathe. The constant movement wasn't doing her temperature any favors, and any heat loss was valuable. Prince Snow snarled after she darted around a hospital chunk to pop up behind him. He flicked his fingers in a nonsensical pattern. Pathetic. Is that really the best you can do? Yes. Not by a long shot. She gave him a smile that would have shown off her eye teeth if not for her mask. Bring it on. The subsequent baseball bat swing at her ribs was uncalled for. A scarf pulled taut between her hands intercepted it and turned the bone-shattering attack into a whisper dulled entirely by her hoodie. She collapsed over the weapon and leaned her weight on it. He dropped it and tried to kick her face, but she had bet on that. Her scarf dissolved and one of her hands broke her fall. The other grabbed the ankle of the foot coming at her. The split second of realization that crossed his face was the best thing Swarm had seen all day. She redirected the momentum of his kick straight up, stood, and threw his foot above her head in one fluid motion. His bots apparently didn't grant him the balance hers did, and his flexibility was shameful. His back hit the ground, but he threw his arms out, and her attempt to give him the people's elbow was interrupted by a dome. She managed to roll off and break the force of the impact, but her elbow and back still smarted. Rude. She rubbed the throbbing joint and inched around the shield, which stretched up until Prince Snow had to be standing inside it. You know, if this is the part where you turn into a butterfly, I'm suing for brand theft. A dissolved dome and lunge with a spear directed at her heart was his response to that. She dodged enough so it scraped her shoulder instead of impaling her somewhere important, but took a punch to her intestines from the follow-through. Her lungs spasmed, and she turned and ran. He was hot on her heels, but the environment was in her favor, and she disappeared behind a partly collapsed wall to catch her breath and think. The current strategy wasn't working. She might be able to tire him out, but she couldn't hurt him. Not easily, and certainly not as effectively as he could. He'd inflict too much damage on her before she could exhaust him, and that's if heat stroke didn't kill her first. She needed to leave. This whole thing had been a string of bad decisions, one right after another, and this was the coup de grace. She would die if she stayed. Come out, wherever you are, Prince Snow sang. He was tapping something against the ground and rubble. Swarm didn't dare peek out of her hiding place to see him. She closed her eyes to better pinpoint his location. Her ears perked up at a noise in the background. Police sirens, and they were getting louder. Reinforcements. Could she hold out until then? Would that even matter? Found you. It came from right above her. The spear appeared in her hands before she could think about it. Luckily, it was tilted enough that it didn't go through Prince Snow's face. In fact, it was tilted at an angle that allowed her to swing it into the side of his head with a fair bit of force. The crack was unpleasant, but the pained yell was sweet as music. Her follow-up right hook was strong enough to send him tumbling back, and she ran around the wall to see the damage. He was on his feet, posture radiating confidence despite the bruise purpling on his cheek. It didn't look broken, which was a relief. His bots had returned to his equivalent of Swarm's neutral state, and he had a smile on his face. He wiped a bit of blood from the corner of his mouth, probably bit his tongue when the spear hit. I wondered how someone pathetic enough to lack access to something as basic as all the presets could kill someone as great as my mentor. Guess this answers that question. A monologue? Score! Or a dialogue. Either way, he wasn't trying to kill her or anyone else right now, and talking was not a free action. Each second brought the cops closer. I didn't kill him. And what the hell were presets? She summoned a boot. See, I don't believe you. How'd you do it? Sneak attack? He rested his hand against his chin and gave her a head-to-toe scan with his eyes. The whole thing was showy. If you wanted to kill me, you should have gone with the same strategy right at the start. Why did everyone think she was a murderer? She'd been there, but she hadn't done anything. I didn't kill him, and I don't want to kill you. Shame that I want to kill you, then. Why? She readied another boot. You're not going to get revenge by killing me, and your bots are better than mine. If this is about me tarnishing his legacy or some crap, he waved a dismissing hand. He had it coming. Hand over your nanobots, and I might spare you. They belong to me anyway. You'll never unlock their full potential. She bit back the vitriol and said flatly, No, he gave them to me. I don't know how, but he did before he died. If I die before figuring out how to hand them over, there's a risk they'll be destroyed. A blatant lie, of course, but hopefully not an obvious one. Common sense dictated that telling a homicidal super the only thing between him and his goal was her heartbeat was a terrible idea. Kill me here and you'll never get your hands on them. Is that all? His smile turned from analytical to cruel, and he raised his hands. How about I give you a little motivation to learn? She threw the boots. They hit his hands and knocked them into his chest, which gave her plenty of time to dodge whatever was about to come her way. She dropped into a crouch and got ready to move, but Prince Snow's bots stayed around him. He growled and raised his hands again, and Swarm wasn't about to let that happen. She sent a small subcloud of bots around each of his hands, turned them into mittens, and darted in. Prince Snow ripped the mittens off, but couldn't block Swarm's fist to his kidney as a result. He heaved, and Swarm dashed back out into the parking lot without slowing down. Her bots came with her as she passed. The police sirens were easily audible now. Swarm reached the center of the lot and summoned the javelin again. Not long left to hold out. Prince Snow got a handle on his pain and swept his arm out. A puddle of spikes raced along the ground towards Swarm, who ran away from it at top speed. Prince Snow's finger pointed at her feet with unerring accuracy, and the puddle gained. Swarm's attempt to use the rough terrain to slow its progress proved fruitless, though she did gain a little distance by using the javelin as a pole vault to leap over craters and rubble that the puddle had to crawl around. Adding in the dizzy headache induced by her rising temperature, the heart sting that heralded bot overuse, and how her feet felt like they were covered in concrete, she knew this was what would kill her. When it was inches from her feet, a gunshot shattered the air. Prince Snow faltered, and the puddle disintegrated. Swarm ducked behind a boulder and leaned on the javelin to catch her breath. She couldn't afford to pull down the mask, but she did roll up her sleeves. It helped a little. From her vantage point, she could see Prince Snow throw up a dome and watched him edge towards an alley. The gunshots didn't start up again after the first one, and he dropped the dome to get in one last jab. You haven't seen the last of me, insect, he snarled. I'll take back what's rightfully mine and mount your head on my wall soon enough. Man, what an ego! And he had terrible taste in decorations. Don't let your mouth write checks you can't cash, downgrade. He vanished into the alley, and Swarm prepared to follow when someone started shouting at her. Drop your weapon and come out with your hands behind your head. That was Detective Valentin, and he sounded royally pissed off. Swarm dismissed the javelin, raised her arms in surrender, and crept out from behind her cover. The good detective was crouched behind his car door and glaring at her over the barrel of his gun. A half-dozen other cops copied his stance, though some cars had been parked horizontally and those cops were kneeling behind the hoods. They made a solid barricade at the edge of the damage to the lot. No way Swarm was getting past that. I said hands behind your head, Detective Valentin shouted. He was too far away for Swarm to get the details of his expression, but she could bet it wasn't anything good. Time to bail. Sorry, can't stay. So long, and thanks for all the fish. She clicked her heels together and popped up on her skates, gave everyone assembled a cheery little two-finger salute, and kicked into an escape. The ruin of the hospital provided excellent cover, and she was long gone by the time the first units pulled themselves together enough to give chase. End of Act 1.